Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
"You're not a team player," she said, not looking me in the eye. Not even glancing up from the canned talking points, she was clearly reading off the company's offboarding script. Her voice as flat as the coffee she hadn't touched since I sat down. Her name was Dana from HR, officially Human Resources Manager, unofficially Damage Control Technician, and she was the kind of person who probably ironed her lunch napkins and believed in the healing power of bullet points. Across from her sat Kyle Blevins, my now former supervisor, the man I had reported exactly 23 days ago for creating a hostile work environment, though judging by the way he kept staring into the corner like a guilty kid caught in the pantry. I figured he already knew this wasn't going to age well. I wasn't shocked. I'd known this was coming from the moment Kyle stopped responding to my emails with anything more than a single word. When a guy like him, slick smile, loud voice, always talking like he's on a stage, goes quiet, it means the knives are out and someone else is holding the blade. And in this case, that someone else was probably someone with a title higher than mine and a fear of lawsuits deeper than their sense of right and wrong. Dana kept talking, and I kept nodding. Something about company culture and organizational harmony and my alleged inability to align with team expectations, as if I hadn't spent the last decade of my life cleaning up other people's mistakes, shielding junior staff from Kyle's temper tantrums, and making sure quarterly targets didn't slide off a cliff when leadership pivoted directions every 3 weeks. They were firing me for not playing nice, when the truth was I'd finally stopped pretending that abuse wrapped in a performance goal was still leadership. I signed the exit papers without saying a word, flipping through the packet like it was a diner menu I'd already memorized, initialing the same tired clauses about property return and confidentiality and transition of responsibilities, which, by the way, I had already documented in a 30-page internal report no one had bothered to read. Carl still hadn't looked at me. That was fine. I'd seen enough of his face in team meetings and fake recognition emails to last me a lifetime. When I handed over my badge, clipped neatly to the last page, like a final period on a sentence I didn't want to keep writing, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I knew something they didn't. Or rather, I knew someone else already did. 3 weeks ago, after one too many passive-aggressive slaps in the face from Kyle, this time directed at a young analyst who'd worked herself sick for a product launch he would later take full credit for, I'd had enough. So I filed a formal report. Not with Dana. Not through the little "how are we doing" button on the company intranet. I filed it directly with the third-party compliance firm the board quietly brought in after a shareholder whistleblower incident the year before. You only know about those back channels if you've been around long enough to see how the sausage gets made and how fast they try to sweep the grease under the rug. I hadn't expected a parade. I hadn't expected much of anything, to be honest. But I did expect retaliation, and now here I was, sitting in a beige room with 2 people pretending this was just a difficult but necessary transition. While the real problem still collected a salary and wore expensive suits that couldn't hide his insecurity. Kyle thought this was over. Thought he'd won. That the report had been buried or brushed aside like every other time someone pushed back. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the investigation had already started. Not internally, not by someone he could lean on or manipulate with buddy-buddy language, and you know how the game works nonsense. No, this one was external, independent, and thorough. They'd called me for a second interview just 2 days ago, thanked me for the documentation I submitted, emails, meeting recordings, Slack threads, copies of quarterly goals rewritten in his own hand after I'd already presented them. That's why I smiled. Because I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was walking away with a full binder of receipts and a timeline that matched every manipulative move Kyle ever made against me or anyone else on that team. I knew the clock was ticking now, and not on my career. On his. What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back like this and smiled while someone else twisted the blade? Be honest. Have you ever dreamed of burning the whole rotten ladder down just to save the people who never got a fair climb? As I walked through the office one last time, I didn't look at the people who avoided my gaze, the ones who looked down at their keyboards and pretended to be absorbed in pivot tables and dashboards. I looked at the few who met my eyes, the ones who nodded, subtly, gratefully, the ones who had been there in those meetings when Kyle raised his voice just enough to make you feel like dirt without ever crossing the HR line. The ones who'd whispered thank you after I spoke up. And to them, I nodded back. They didn't know it yet, but this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Before Kyle Blevins ever had a title worth printing on a business card, before he turned performance reviews into punishment rituals and conference rooms into confession booths. I was already in that building, quietly doing the work no one else wanted, cleaning up after executives who only showed up when there was press or pressure. 14 years is a long time to keep your head down and your hands steady, especially in an industry that loves to chew up the ones who stay too long and spit them out just before their pensions vest. I didn't start with big ambitions. I didn't want a corner office or a flashy title. I just wanted to do my job well, take care of my family, and maybe, just maybe, build something that outlasted the ego contests happening 2 floors above me. The company was smaller then. Messy, but honest. You could still walk down the hall without hearing buzzwords echoing off the walls or seeing glass-walled offices filled with people practicing their TED Talk voices in front of full-length mirrors. When Kyle arrived, he didn't come with a bang. He slipped in through a mid-level reorg, one of those subtle restructures where someone with a clean haircut and a tin-slide deck suddenly starts sitting in on meetings they didn't earn the right to attend. He started as a manager in client ops. Fresh from some failed startup, he talked about like it was a combat mission. He knew how to smile at the right people, not at the right times, and blame someone else when numbers didn't go the way they were supposed to. That kind of talent gets noticed, even if it shouldn't. I watched him move up the ladder the way you watch a spider climb a wall, slowly, deliberately, and with the kind of hunger that doesn't care what it steps on along the way. He was polite in public, venomous in private, always telling people he expected excellence, but never defining what that meant. If your numbers were good, they were his idea. If your numbers were bad, it was your attitude. He kept his hands clean by throwing everyone else under the bus, and leadership let him do it because the graphs kept pointing upward and the complaints never quite reached the threshold for official concern. I stayed out of his way for as long as I could. I handled my projects, protected my team, and kept the peace, even when that meant swallowing the occasional insult or cleaning up data he'd massaged into something more investor-friendly. I wasn't the kind of guy who ran to HR every time someone raised their voice, and I sure as hell wasn't going to waste breath trying to correct a guy who'd already decided that respect was something other people owed him, not something he had to earn. But everything changed the day he went after Lauren. Lauren was new. Bright, sharp, the kind of young professional who actually cared about the work and asked good questions instead of just nodding through jargon. She was assigned to our team as part of a development rotation, and within a month, she had built a new tracking tool that saved us 2 hours a week on reporting. She was the kind of person who should have been nurtured, coached, encouraged, protected. Instead, Kyle crushed her. It started with small things, publicly questioning her numbers in meetings he hadn't attended, undermining her presentations with offhand comments like, "We'll take this offline," or "Let's not get caught in the weeds." Then came the late-night emails, the ones with vague criticisms and impossible-to-meet expectations, always CC'd to half the leadership team so her failure would be documented in real time. He picked at her confidence like a loose thread, and within 6 weeks, the same woman who once asked for more responsibility was now showing up late, avoiding eye contact, and staying long after everyone else had left, just to double-check her work in silence. I pulled her aside one evening, just before 9, when we were the last 2 people still staring at the glow of our screens. I asked her if she was okay, and she nodded too quickly, said she was just adjusting, that Kyle had high standards. And that's when I knew she was already starting to believe it was her fault. That was the moment I stopped being quiet. I started keeping records, dates, times, screenshots, everything. I combed through meeting logs, pulled flagged edits from the shared drive, and cross-referenced his comments with our actual project status. I wasn't building a case out of spite. I was building it because I knew no one would believe me if I didn't show them everything, and because I couldn't sit in that office another day knowing I'd watched someone get crushed under the weight of someone else's ego and did nothing. I filed the report the following Monday. Not the quick HR chat that gets logged and forgotten. I went through the company's third-party ethics channel, the one they introduced after the last round of executive scandal made the front page of a trade magazine. It was anonymous, but I gave my name anyway. I gave every detail. I attached documents. I sent the truth, clean and unpolished. They said I'd hear back soon. And I did. But not in the way I expected. Kyle found out, of course. He always does. The walls have ears, and the C-suite has a way of protecting its own until the optics turn sour. Within 2 weeks, I was getting pulled from projects, left out of meetings, and given tasks that made no sense for someone with my background. Then came the HR invite. Then the phrase, "not a team player." Then the badge handover. 14 years. 0 warnings. One toxic manager who finally crossed a line. But I didn't leave empty-handed. I left knowing the clock was ticking not on me, but on him. And this time, I wasn't the one running out of time. It started with a whisper, the kind that drifts through the air like smoke before anyone realizes something's on fire, and once it caught wind inside that building, there was no stopping it. I wasn't there to see it firsthand, obviously, but I didn't have to be. The text started coming in almost immediately after my exit email bounced around the company like a pinball. Quiet messages from people I hadn't heard from in months, some I barely knew. Most of them saying the same thing in different ways. I'm so sorry. I think you were right. He's losing it. At first, I thought it was the usual sympathy wave, that temporary guilt storm that hits after someone gets pushed out and people realize they might have stayed silent when they should have spoken up. But this felt different. I could tell by the speed, the tone, the volume. Something had shifted. The air around Kyle Blevins, once so thick with power and protection, was starting to thin out, and the cracks he worked so hard to hide behind fake charm and self-assured nonsense were finally showing. From what I heard, it began with a rumor that someone else had filed a complaint, then another, then a third, this one from a department completely outside our team. And while HR tried to contain it, tried to play it off as internal recalibrations and team structure reviews, people weren't buying it this time. The quiet ones, the ones who'd been stepped on, sidelined, talked down to, and passed over, they started talking. Not shouting, not grandstanding, just speaking. And when enough people start speaking, even the most carefully crafted lies start shaking loose at the seams. Kyle didn't handle it well. According to Aaron, who somehow kept me in the loop with coded texts and cryptic subject lines, he started unraveling about a week after I left. The first sign was a meeting he stormed out of, no explanation, just stood up mid-sentence and walked out while the room sat in stunned silence. Then came the long reply-all emails filled with passive-aggressive jabs about executional accountability and visibility issues, corporate speak for, I'm scared and I don't know who to blame yet. But it got worse. He started pulling people into one-on-ones, unannounced and uninvited, cornering analysts and mid-level managers and grilling them about who said what, who knew what, who might have talked to HR, or worse, legal. People came out of his office pale and silent, and within days, half the team had started documenting their own conversations, saving screenshots, checking timestamps. You know things are going sideways when employees start using burner email addresses to submit ethics complaints, not because they want to bring someone down, but because they're genuinely afraid of being dragged under with him. The company, or rather the leadership still pretending everything was fine, finally brought in an outside consultant, some third-party firm that specializes in workplace culture assessments, but really exists to figure out how much plausible deniability you can get away with before someone sues. They sent in a team of clean-cut professionals who smiled too much, asked too little, and carried clipboards like they were about to audit your soul. But the moment that team showed up on the 5th floor, everyone knew this wasn't just about one complaint anymore. This was damage control in a blazer. Kyle tried to keep control. He doubled down on his fake charm, turned every sentence into a performance, every hallway conversation into a campaign speech. But the walls were already talking. His allies were backing away. Even the ones who used to parrot his every word in meetings suddenly had other rooms to be in, other calls to take. The man who once walked through the office like he owned it now looked like someone trying to figure out where the exits were without looking like he was running. Meanwhile, I watched from the sidelines. Not smug, not vindictive, just tired. Tired in a way that doesn't go away with sleep. Tired from the years I spent trying to protect people like Lauren from people like Kyle. Tired of being told to just focus on the work, while someone chipped away at your dignity one sarcastic comment at a time. Tired of HR pretending to be Switzerland while the rest of us got torn apart in a war we didn't start. But even through the fatigue, I felt something else. Not satisfaction exactly, but maybe clarity. A sense that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined it, that the things I saw, the patterns, the manipulation, the gaslighting, weren't just part of the job. They were abuse. Polished and professional and wrapped in a tie, but abuse all the same. And now? Now the dominoes were falling. Not because I pushed them, but because someone finally noticed the pattern. Because one person said something, and another person said something else, and then it became impossible to pretend it wasn't happening. I didn't burn the place down. I just stopped holding it up. And from what I was hearing, The whole building was starting to sway. It arrived in a plain manila envelope with no return address, tucked neatly into my mailbox one damp Tuesday morning like it was just another piece of junk mail trying not to call attention to itself. There was no letter, no postmark, not even a note inside, just a small black USB flash drive taped to a square of cardboard like some kind of homemade evidence exhibit. I stood on my front porch holding it in one hand and a half-drunk cup of coffee in the other, staring at it for a long moment, already knowing exactly what it was before I ever plugged it into my laptop. And when I did, well, let's just say it confirmed everything I suspected and then some. Inside were folders, not just a few, but dozens, all labeled and dated with a precision that screamed of someone who'd been living in fear and documenting everything not out of paranoia, but out of pure survival instinct. The kind of meticulous cataloging that only comes from working under someone who uses power like a weapon and praise like bait. Meeting transcripts, screenshots of Slack messages, spreadsheets comparing original project scopes to the ones Kyle had doctored for senior leadership, even phone audio recordings from check-ins where his tone shifted so hard you could feel it through the speakers. I recognized the organizational style immediately. It was Emily's. She was a junior project analyst who joined the team about a year before I left, quiet but quick, smart in that low-profile way that tends to get overlooked until suddenly it doesn't. She was sharp, loyal to the work, not the nonsense. I tried to shield her from Kyle's worst outbursts, but once I was gone, she was left exposed, and I had a feeling she knew it wouldn't end well if she didn't protect herself. One of the folders was named Executive Threads, and when I opened it, I swear my hands tightened involuntarily on the keyboard. There they were, emails between senior leadership, including at least 2 VPs, casually discussing Kyle's abrasive style and how it's easier to let him run the floor than risk another PR headache. Another gem read, "We're not in a position to lose performance leaders right now, even if they're rough around the edges." And yet another, "Let's have HR make this go away quietly." There it was, in writing, proof that they knew, that they'd known, and that they'd chosen to do nothing. Actually, worse than nothing. They had chosen to cover it up, chosen to protect Kyle's ego and their own reputations at the expense of every employee under his boot. The abuse wasn't just tolerated. It was enabled. And now someone had sent the receipts directly to me. I didn't send it to the press. Not yet. I forwarded the folder, encrypted, to the external compliance firm that had taken over the investigation after the company's internal channels became too compromised to trust. And within 48 hours, the house of cards started folding like wet cardboard. It began with another round of mandatory interviews, but this time no one was buying the neutral tone or the smiles. Legal stepped in. Not HR. Not comms. Legal. Suits in black. Briefcases with tabs and timelines. Voices too calm to mean anything good. Kyle, according to what I heard through a contact still in procurement, went silent for 3 full days, missed 2 meetings, and then showed up late to an all-hands looking pale and punchy, like someone who'd just realized the tide wasn't receding, it was rising. He tried to spin it, of course. Claimed there was a coordinated campaign to damage his leadership reputation, tried to cast doubt on the records, said they were taken out of context, misrepresented, misleading. But the problem with lying is that you eventually run out of different ways to tell the same story. And when the timeline doesn't match your version, when receipts are timestamped, cross-referenced, and backed up in 15 places, there's not a whole lot of context left to hide behind. The reversal came fast. One board member, the one who'd always been more concerned with shareholder optics than internal politics, reportedly called an emergency meeting and made it clear that if Kyle didn't step aside voluntarily, the alternative would be a public distancing that would send the stock into a minor tailspin. The word scapegoat was used. So was brand damage. And just like that, the golden boy who once walked around the office with a chest full of bravado and a smirk full of condescension was escorted out through the back by security after hours with no announcement, no farewell email, no good luck card passed around the break room. They would say he resigned. Voluntarily. For personal reasons. To pursue new opportunities. That's how these things always go. The official narrative would be bland and bloodless, but the real story, the one written in Slack archives and BCC'd emails and after-hours therapy sessions, that story was now backed up, documented, and archived on servers far outside the company's reach. And me? I didn't feel vindicated. Not exactly. I felt finished. I'd carried the truth around like a stone in my chest for months. waiting for someone to either believe it or break it. And now that it was out in the open, thanks to a junior employee who had more guts than half the executive team combined, I could finally exhale. The truth had legs now. And Kyle? He was running out of places to hide. The email arrived like a weak apology from someone who thought the check would fix what their silence had already destroyed. A polished note from the company's external counsel, full of sugar-coated terms like amicable resolution and confidentiality arrangement, attached to a settlement offer that they assumed would be enough to buy my silence and bury the story for good. They even padded it with an exit package that looked generous on paper: 6 months' salary, a clean reference, a legal disclaimer they hoped I wouldn't read too carefully, and one small clause near the end that said I would agree to refrain from further commentary, internal or external, regarding prior company operations or personnel conduct. I didn't need time to think about it. I wasn't for sale. They thought I was angry, that I'd want revenge or retribution or some loud, messy exit that would give them something to point at and say, "See, he was unstable." But what they didn't understand, even after everything that had happened, was that I didn't want their money. I wanted the truth to breathe, and not in whispers, not in back rooms, not in another anonymous ethics box that gets investigated by the same people trying to keep it quiet. I wanted the truth to sit down in the middle of the office, in plain view, and not leave until people finally looked at it without flinching. So I wrote something of my own. I didn't send it from my personal email. I didn't post it online or blast it on social media. That's not how you reach the people who matter. I sent it from an old employee account that still had access to the company-wide distribution list, the same one they used for newsletters and wellness tips and fun facts about executive birthdays no one cared about. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't vindictive. It was a plain text email, no formatting, no links, no attachments. Just words, careful, deliberate, and mine. The subject line read, "To the real team players." I told them I wasn't writing out of bitterness, but out of respect, for the people who came in early and stayed late, who covered for each other, who trained new hires without ever getting credit, who endured the meetings, the metrics, the missed promotions, and the management fads that changed every quarter like fashion trends in a failing magazine. I told them I remembered what it was like to care about the mission, before the mission turned into a slogan and the slogan turned into a punchline. I wrote about the culture, not the one they advertised, but the one that really existed between the cracks. The kind where speaking up meant being branded difficult, where silence was rewarded with visibility, where high performance only mattered if it made your boss look good in a slide deck. I reminded them how easy it is to mistake fear for respect, and how hard it is to recover your dignity once someone's stolen it from you in front of a room full of your peers. I didn't name Kyle. I didn't have to. Everyone knew who I meant when I wrote about leaders who manage by intimidation and take credit like it's oxygen. I didn't accuse the company of corruption. I just pointed out that silence, the kind that lets abuse go unchecked, doesn't start at the bottom, it starts at the top. I ended the email with a single line that wasn't angry or self-righteous, just true. I wasn't fired for not being a team player. I was fired for being the only one who finally said no. By lunchtime, the email had been read by over 400 people. By 1 o'clock, it was being forwarded to private group chats and bookmarked in shared drives. By 3, I got a text from a former colleague that said, "Someone just printed your email and taped it to the break room wall." Another one said, "They're calling it the gospel according to Mike." One more, "Dana from HR looks like she's going to implode." Some people cried. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. I got messages from 3 employees I barely worked with who said they hadn't realized how broken things had become until they saw it written out like that. Plain, unvarnished, undeniable. Others were furious. A few higher-ups, from what I heard, tried to frame it as an emotional outburst, a burn-it-all-down moment from someone who couldn't take the heat. But the people who mattered? They knew. They always knew. And as for me, I finally exhaled. I closed my laptop, turned off my phone, and stepped outside for the first time in what felt like years without carrying the invisible weight of someone else's dysfunction on my back. I walked to the corner cafe, ordered a sandwich I didn't have to eat at my desk, and sat there in the sun, thinking about what came next, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of possibility. No more smiling through lies. No more pretending incompetence is brilliance just because it wears a suit. No more playing a rigged game just to keep the lights on. I didn't know where I'd go next, but I knew this. I was finally free to tell the truth, and nothing they could offer, not money, not flattery, not silence, was worth giving that up. They built their image on our effort. They built their success on our silence. But this time, the last word belonged to us.